Hey guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's episode, I just want to talk about some things I've learned in my own personal experiences with like delayed gratification and just like where I am in my life and just kind of hoping to help somebody else out there. So I think for me, I'll start off by saying this. I really grew up, I was raised by my dad. So I was taught to really take accountability for a lot of things in my life. And I think that type of mentality kind of sets you up in part to be a little too reliant on your own strength. And what I mean by that, I feel like I used to have the attitude that like everything is banking on me. And you'll hear a lot of motivational speakers and a lot of people who are in that space tell you those things as well. They'll tell you that like everything in your life is banking on you. You are you're the one who's going to do X, Y, and Z. And though that's true, there are a lot of factors that are outside of your control. I remember I was speaking with my therapist about someone who I felt like was, in a sense, very demeaning towards me because of this person's accomplishments and things like that. And I just realized that, like, people have different experiences and people have different hands that are dealt. So, for me, I realized that like in my life right now, there were certain expectations I had and things I put on myself that just were never realistic, right? Because I didn't have certain things. I always talk about this, like we talk about the myth of meritocracy, right? And it's no different than the myth of like, well, I'm not saying the myth, but it's no different than privilege, right? We don't realize that in order to really have a successful functioning human being, and you talk about like who has reached certain heights of success, you really do have to have one heck of a support system. I've noticed this in my work. You guys know I was top writer on Medium for NFL. In my studying of like the NFL, one thing that was very common was that they've always had a mother, they've always had a grandmother, aunt, you know what I mean? Someone who was there literally encouraging them and was at every practice, who was doing everything like along the way. And I use this analogy because I think sometimes we don't realize this, right? Like when you think about the health of a baby, the health of a child, the cognitive development of children, even in their academic career, a lot of times the children who are the most successful are the ones who have the parents who are the most involved, right? It's your parents who maybe have resources or who have connections, or they may know about certain programs and things like that, who could actually help the child to become successful academically. Maybe the parent went to college themselves or whatever, you know what I mean? So I just think a lot of times, especially when we're in this space of social media, I don't think that it's comparison that is necessarily, like, I'm not talking about comparison in terms of it robbing us of our joy. I'm talking about comparison in terms of us having certain aspirations and hopes and desires and things like that. So I think the reality is this. We have to understand that, when it comes to a lot of things in life, like so much of the things that we desire, sometimes those things are just a little lofty. You know what I mean? I used to have certain expectations for myself, and I realized that like it was never that I wasn't capable, but it's a really there's a grievance when you start to realize like, oh, you know what I mean, I don't have certain outcomes because that was not the lot that was dealt to me, right? And it wasn't that I was never capable, but it was just like, that's not my story, that's not the hand that I've been dealt, that's not something that's realistic or feasible for my life. You know what I mean? Like I was never going to be in that space because I didn't have X, Y, and Z. And I think a lot of times because of our because we kind of put people on a pedestal, and when we become successful ourselves, we want to be the self-made person. We want to be someone who people can who people look up to, right? We want to be inspirational. So we want to come out and we tell people things like, yes, I was this and I was doing all this, but we literally fail to acknowledge all the people and all the things that have been behind us to push us forward. You hear this a lot, especially in modern movements when women talk about men. We know like there were, women who've always been educators and things like that of the community, holding down their husbands' businesses and things like that. But a lot of times the people who are on the back end don't get the spotlight. And it could be one, they just don't really care to have the spotlight, which is nothing wrong with that. We all know when you're being on a team, typically there can only be one star player. So it's like, we get that. We know how to collaborate. We know how to work together. But at the end of the day, I think sometimes, we just kind of fail to acknowledge the realism that like, yeah, it takes a lot of support to really be in a certain space. And I think the reason why we don't really like having these conversations is because people want to feel hopeful. People want to feel like they can actually achieve any and everything. And it's not that you can't, but I think back to what I'm saying about the whole premise of this video is things I've learned about instant gratification. Sometimes, you know, things aren't going to happen when you expect them to happen. And I think as much as we talk about instant gratification, we never really put two and two together to realize like, no, there's so much realism in the fact that like it takes a long time to really do a thing. And I think because even I've witnessed this for myself, and I think we all have at this point, we've all been kind of bit by the bug of possibility, right? Especially when it comes to social media and convenience. I mean, I've seen content creators come out here and literally have like 100,000 subscribers within the first year. You know what I mean? We've seen it. So we start to think that it's our lives, and that's how it should work for everybody. I think even in terms of like marriages and relationships, like just everything. And I think being someone who carried that mentality for so long because I put so much weight on myself. I used to think, okay, if it's not happening, it's because it's not for me. When the truth was that like, no, it really takes time to like actually build a thing and actually make it a thing. So it's like you really do have to kind of really check yourself, in your expectations whenever you start something, because if not, you're really going to be set up for so much disappointment. I was watching Sex and the City last night. Y'all know that's funny, one of my like favorite shows. It's such a, I used to binge that show, like, especially anyway, love it. So anyway, and Carrie was getting her banner. She was a writer, and she had finally got like this banner for her column, and they were going to put it on the side of the bus, and her friends came out and like they did like champagne and they were just like celebrating her. And I realized that that's the thing, right? That's really what's missing in from a lot of our communities. That's really what's missing from a lot of the people in our lives. We do great things and people don't acknowledge it because it's not a big thing, right? We have standardized success to the point where we no longer have individualized success. We actually look down on people who don't have certain standards of success. Now, obviously, college has always been a very prominent proponent of this, right? Conformity. If you go to college, you got that status. You know what I mean? Like, you are socially accepted. You're in community. You know what I mean? It's okay. But I think even outside of that, you have a small business, and maybe your business is not doing, six figures. Maybe it's not doing $1 million. Maybe it's doing a cool 45. Maybe it's doing a cool 50. Maybe it's doing 65. Whatever the case may be, you're able to provide for yourself. But because it's a smaller thing compared to societal standards, because at this point we're getting more and more grandiose as the months come, it's not celebrated. And you just feel like you just kind of start to look at yourself differently. So I just kind of wanted to come on and share that, because I realized that for myself, it's like, no, you have to really realize like the things that you do are really cool. You know what I mean? Like, it's really cool and you deserve to be celebrated. And it's not always that people are hating on you. Sometimes, yes, but I do realize that overall, our minds have been hijacked in such a way, we just don't celebrate the little things anymore. You know what I mean? I even think about this in terms of like being a newlywed, you know what I mean, being married, and you don't really think about like how significant that is, because it's like, oh, it's like, oh, you just got married, when it's a pretty big, I would say it's a pretty big deal, right? You have dated, your entire life. You've had a lot of no's, you've had heartbreaks, you've had slip ups, you've had mistakes, you've done all these things. And so you finally got to this point where it's like, oh, you know what I mean? That's pretty significant. And so I just more so wanted to get on here and say, like, you really do have to check yourself in terms of like instant gratification, because it creeps up on us in a lot of subtle ways. And when we start thinking about ourselves and our standards of success and our expectations that we have for one another and even on ourselves, you have to understand there are a lot of factors that actually go into success that are outside of your control. And even if you were to start a thing and be consistent with that thing and do that thing to the best of your ability, it may not amount to something else, and it could be for factors outside of your control. So I hope that this like encourages somebody, because I just feel like that's so timely. And I'll say this too, me being in a space where I've had to grieve certain things, certain friendships that I had that like fallen off, certain dreams, I had to get to a place, because I think that this is the art of surrender. It's when you start to realize like, oh, wait a minute. You know what I mean? I have to come into terms with the fact that this thing may never come to pass, and I have to be okay with that. You know what I mean? There's an influencer that I follow on Instagram. Her name is Anna Mae, which I think is such a cool name. She's Anime Groves. I'm actually going to shout her out here because truly, truly admirable. She reminds me so much of myself. But and you know, she talked about how she always wanted to be in fashion, and she ultimately ended up going to a fashion show, but it wasn't until her 40s. And she talked about how she had to get to a place of acceptance, and she started to accept that, you know, certain things, certain dreams that she wanted to come to pass never came to pass in her lifetime. And I think that that's probably one of the things about the dream deferred, right? When we talk about answering Langston Hughes, right, famous poem, you know, Harlem, like what happens to the dream deferred, you know? And I've always, you know, I made a video and I talked about this, like just answering that question, because we talk about it, but we never really answer the question. And I want to know, like, what happens to the dream deferred? And I talked about, you know, how that dream eventually becomes a different dream. But I think there's a process of grief. You know, there's a unique process of grief for grieving a dream, because it's not like the death of a loved one. You know what I mean? But it's this potential, this thing that you really thought was going to come to pass. And so the truth is that, you know, when you're in the midst of it, we really don't know what God's going to do in our lives. Like I don't think that there's anyone who can really tell you, you know, what the future holds. I think as much as we try, and I think as much as, you know, we just do our best at the end of the day, but I don't think that anyone can really tell you, like, this is what's going to happen in your life. You know what I mean? Because nobody knows. But there really is something in like surrendering, you know, especially because you can only do what you can do, you know, and there's a lot of things that are outside of your control, but it doesn't diminish the potential that is inside of you, that is still going to be inside of you, the worth, that inherent worth that is inside of you, regardless if that thing doesn't come to pass, you know? So I believe that faith is kind of birthed in surrender. I think when you kind of let go of a thing and you start to kind of just do your best every day and do what you can do, and you open yourself up to the possibility of that thing coming, because 9 times out of 10, I've learned 10 times out of 10, it very rarely comes in the ways in which we expect. It oftentimes comes in a completely different form. And because sometimes we can be so tunnel vision, because that's what we're encouraged to do, we miss it or we fail to appreciate the thing. But yeah, so that's just something I've learned. And I just kind of wanted to get on here and share that with somebody who, you know, if you're a high performer, you're someone who's professionistic a little bit like myself, and you're struggling with the realism, you know, the reality of your life or certain things, you know. So life very rarely looks like social media. It very rarely looks like this perfect picture. It very rarely looks like anything you probably could have ever imagined. But you know, when you really look at life and you look at your life specifically, you see how far you've come, you know, and you start to see just how much you've grown. You know what I mean? And I think that that is something that's worth celebrating. So I guess today's topic is like, celebrate yourself, you know, celebrate your wins, celebrate where you are in your life. And if you don't have anybody to celebrate with you, celebrate with God.